Welcome everyone to the last chapter of the textbook that we're going to be covering, Chapter 8, Ethical Decision Making for Social and Ethical Issues in Business. I think it's probably pertinent that we turn to page 235 of your textbook. There's an interesting quote that I want to sort of extrapolate and talk about, as well as I want to take a look at the contents so you know that what we're going to be covering in the set of video lectures that go with this particular chapter. So I'll start off with the quote that's at the beginning of that chapter. It says that the self is not something ready-made, but something in continuous formation through choice of action. And this particular quote by John Dewey is an excellent lead-off to the chapter, because what it reminds us of is that ethical decision making, or just choices in general, are what define us, and our choices become the level at which we can look to see how much growth we have with respect to becoming ethical practitioners, both in the workplace and in our everyday lives, as well as society, as they're going to talk to us in this chapter about. So it's important to sort of key in on that particular quotation there, that's saying, we're always learning and we're always growing, and we can reflect on this and look back at the choices we made as part of the formation of who we are, and again, what defines us as human beings. And this is pretty much undebated, or not something that a lot of people debate about, because it is pretty obvious that the collection of choices that we make take us to a particular place in our life, whether it be in our job or our individual sort of relationships with others. So that's an important piece just to start off the chapter. The other important part is just to look at the contents of what's being covered here. We're looking at ethical decision making within society first, then ethical decision making within the organization or within your occupation, your profession. We're looking a little bit at descriptive and normative ethics in this chapter. Ethical decision making as an individual, or on an individual basis, is the last thing that they look at, and then the conclusion of this chapter, the authors present a personal action plan that we might consider, both again in our professions and in our personal lives. So as those two things intersect with each other, as our occupation and our goal to be ethical practitioners collides. And so that's interesting sort of way to think about it. So all of those contents, and again, that leading quote that starts off the chapter. If you go to if you follow along with the slide presentation, you'll see there is, again, the emphasis here is making ethical decisions within society, within the organization or the workplace, as an individual, and then lastly, as I said, developing a personal action plan. So what I've done on the slides is sort of narrow the discussion of the important pieces of the chapter. If you move to the next slide, you'll see just a basic breakdown of what we should be considering when we're looking at making better ethical choices or decisions within society. The first thing I say there is a society is a group of people who are bound by common laws, and really that's what ties us together, is the laws and the principles and the rules that we have that govern us and keep us as a functioning civilized unit. And those things are based typically on, at least in a democracy, social conventions and attitudes. However, when our attitudes change and when we develop or when we cultivate new social conventions, then we can question the old ones and replace them. Sort of like what we would do if we're building a code of ethics within an organization and we see that some things aren't working, or that some of the principles we're expecting people to follow are not practical enough to be followed. So we have to revisit them and change them. So I said in the last chapter that developing the code of ethics is sort of developing this living document that we always go back to and revise and edit as needed and when it's needed. And it's the same thing with when we talk about making ethical choices. Sound ethical choices um, involve us or require us to look at the attitudes that different people have, and of course survey those attitudes, and then make the best choice that we can, given the dilemma that we're faced with or the conflict that has arisen. Again, whether it be in the workplace or within our personal lives. I also say there, when enough people question a social convention, what tends to happen is the law that it's based on gets changed or revised or reworked. When a law is changed in time, social attitudes adopt a new social convention. Uh, they adopt a new social convention or expectation. If you go into your chapter on the next page, you'll see that they talk about this. They sort of elaborate on that idea on page 236, that at one time, really the roots of ethical life were religion and law. And today it's beyond that. It's both religion, it's beyond religion, and even beyond law, to the extent that as ethical practitioners, we're thinking about what those attitudes are that other people have, and how they might not be working, or how a person in a particular scenario might not be able to make this particular choice because of religion, or because they don't believe that the law serves society well. And we're allowed to sort of question and inquire and discern, to think about these things as we go through our lives. And it's the same thing within the organization. Whoever we end up working for, we should be in a position where we can ask questions about the principles that we're expected to be following. If they're not working, then again we have to look at adapting them and changing them ultimately, so that they do work, and so that we can live in some kind of a union with each other, given that we all generally expect the same thing at the end of the day from each other, in terms of things like fairness and justice and equality and those sorts of things, freedoms. It also says there that on page 236, removing the religious authority behind a nation's laws is essential. It's an essential step in permitting discussion, change, and growth. So really, as ethical practitioners, this is another sort of point that's vital for us to understand, that as ethical practitioners, we want to encourage discussion, we want to encourage change and growth, and we shouldn't be afraid of it, and whether it be, again, in our personal lives or in the organization. There is some examples for you to look at the top of page 237 that are interesting, in terms of also, getting a feel for how people think differently about different things. And they give us two examples in your textbook, Bob and Susan, at the top of page 238, for us to at least consider at the outset and give some thought to, as it relates to the content that they're talking about in your chapter. So it does say Bob was opposed to physician-assisted suicide until he watched his mother suffer through an excruciatingly long and painful death. Now he lobbies and he speaks out in favor of physician-assisted suicide. And then Susan always held a conventional attitude toward marriage. When the issue of gay marriage surfaced, she was opposed to the practice almost by reflex. However, after reading several newspaper articles on the subject, seeing gay couples on TV newscasts, and discussing the issue with her friends, her attitude changed. And so that's key here. We can see that Bob once had, in the first example, a particular attitude towards physician-assisted suicide, and it changed as a result of personal experience, going through an experience with his mother. And this happens a lot in the sort of practice of ethics, or in the situations that we find ourselves in as people. And we have to expect that, once these situations occur in our lives, that we're able to be open-minded enough, and I'll return to that concept of open-mindedness. We have to be open-minded enough to look at changing those attitudes where it is warranted, or where we've given it enough thought to make those changes. And the same thing really is the case with Susan. Once we have experience, or once we do a little bit of our own homework and research on things, we could change our attitudes. And to be a true ethical practitioner, this is another one of those essential ingredients, I would say, that that has to happen, or we have to adopt. And what is that? That's this sort of idea that we need to be open-minded, and that's an ingredient, I would say, of living an ethical life, a sound, good sort of ethical life. To be good is to, at least in the sense of modern society, to be a good person or to be a moral agent involves being open-minded to the attitudes and views of others, not necessarily because we have to believe what they believe, but where there is justification to change our attitudes, then we shouldn't be afraid to do so, especially when those changes are justifiable or justified. So another thing for us to sort of key in on as an ingredient to living an ethical life. The next thing I want to go through is on the slide presentations entitled Ethics in the Law. And we're going to get into this just a little bit before we move into our next video lecture. Just want to touch on it, that there has always been a sort of brother-sister relationship between ethics and the law. We know that a lot of the laws that we're expected to follow in a society were framed out of, or are rooted in, ethics, and they're rooted in principles that we've talked about. A lot of the theories that we covered in the course actually can be woven into the laws that we have today, and that we're expected to sort of follow in society. And there's a relationship with those laws and the theory that we talked about. And of course, the different dilemmas that change us and that continuously happen, and the fact that a lot of the situations that we confront are different, whether it be on the individual level or within the workplace. So I say on that slide that the law in general reflects society's required standards of conduct, the way that people need to act, and that, as we say, ethics, the law is rooted in ethics for the most part, but not always. We can have particular laws that we're expected to follow that don't really have a solid ground in ethics. And so thinking about the relationship between ethics and the law is of use to an ethical practitioner, or someone that is trying to make better choices. I say also, ethics includes standards of conducts that go beyond what is required by the law. Following the law is what we're expected to do to live in a civilized society. And of course, there's punishment when we don't follow the law. There's consequences involved, just like there is with ethics. But ethics and becoming an ethical practitioner moves beyond what we're required to do or what we're expected to do in society, to a level of why should we be following this particular law, especially where a law doesn't seem to be working, or a principle is no longer valid for us to be following in a given society. So you see that once you start to look at the relationship between ethics and the law. The overlap is where our ethics is in accordance with the law. Sometimes, and even, we might even say a lot of times in the workplace, there's things that we do that we can break the law, that we would be breaking the law, or things that we would call illegal, but there's also things that we would call immoral. And then there's a sort of connection between what is immoral and what is illegal. But sometimes there is a lack of a connection. So again, thinking about these things is at least at the base level what brings this idea of ethical practicing into focus. And it's okay to do that, to ask questions about the relationship between the law and uh, and and the ethics that we are expected to follow, whether we are committing to those for ourselves or whether they're put upon us in the workplace. So in the next video lecture, the next part to this chapter, we're going to get into making ethical decisions within the organization. I'll see you then.